It's 9:30, so I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So this is IT in a post-pandemic world. My name is Josh Morden. I'm the IT manager for Evans Consulting. We're in Falls Church, Virginia. And I'm here today to talk to you about how IT has changed and how the way that we do IT has changed with everything that has happened in the pandemic and lingering effects of that. So just a little bit about me. I've been working in IT for 8 years. Initially, actually, I was in pre-med when I was in college and kind of had aspirations to become a doctor. And then when I realized that wasn't really for me, and so post-college I kind of made a career change. And so when I was thinking about getting into IT management, went and got my MBA, and then the rest has been history since then. I have a little bit of diverse experience in different companies. Currently, the one that I work for is a business consulting firm. So we're a federal contractor, mostly working with the FAA and a little bit with the Air Force as well. Mostly remote staff, really into 365 and SharePoint. Previously, I worked for another company that many of you may be familiar with, Fred Rogers Productions. It was a media production company, and so I got some experience with dealing with very large data sets and kind of how that works in the production cycle for creating children's television shows. And I have a little bit of experience in higher education as well. My first job was, at a Presbyterian seminary in Pittsburgh, and so I really had the privilege there to learn from the IT director, who was basically just like a wizard in IT, and kind of learned a lot about what's the right way to do IT and best practices and what a good structure should look like. So that's a little bit about my background and what I'll be drawing on to kind of in my talk today. So an overview of what we'll be covering. We'll talk a little bit about kind of the impact of COVID-19. We'll talk about what's changed, what remains the same. We'll go over some recommendations that I have just from my experience, and we'll have some time for Q&A. So talk about COVID-19 impact. COVID-19, I don't think I have to explain the effect that had on the business world. With a lot of governments, overnight putting stay-at-home orders and work-from-home orders, we, in a matter of hours, changed from going to the office to being a virtual workforce. And a lot of companies were not really prepared for that, didn't have the technology resources to be able to handle people needing to connect to the office with being remote. I have a friend who works for one of the largest hospital networks in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and what he had to actually do in the first year, and a lot of people on his team, was have work days where he'd start from like 6 p.m. until like 1 a.m. at night, because that was the time when they could have the VPN bandwidth to get on and do their work. They didn't have that capacity at that time. So a lot of companies, that was something they had to kind of struggle with at the beginning. Also, virtual work obviously expanded the attack surface of our environments. Before, we had these nicely walled gardens with everything in, if you were mostly working in the office. And then now that we went remote, now you have these devices and networks that we don't have, we don't have view into what's happening there and that sort of thing. So a lot of changes in what we had to think about to keep the things secure. Well, thankfully, the COVID-19 pandemic has mostly moved on, but as is the nature with these sorts of major events, there's lots of times permanent impacts to that. And one of them is that remote workforce doesn't look like it's going to be going away. SpiceWorks, Ziff Davis did a report last year for the future of work, and in their survey, companies said that they estimated about 25% of their workforce would continue to be doing at least partially remote, even after the pandemic was finished. Personally, I think the numbers are probably going to be a lot higher than that, particularly when you see stories like Apple and how their employees reacted when they tried to make people come back. I think that probably it might be more than 40, 50, I'm just guessing anecdotally, but the point is, whatever the number is, there's going to be a large number of people that are working at least 1 or 2 days out of the office, and that impacts how we're going to do IT. Another interesting impact is that people are working more hours. The National Bureau of Economic Research in 2020 found that after the pandemic started, the average workday for most people increased 48.5 minutes. So that's almost an hour additional work. And if you think about it, when you don't have that split previously where you're working and then you go home and now you're kind of at home that's separate from work, it can be a little bit easier to kind of do additional work. And I mean, we even see that even in my company. I've seen people working even 11 o'clock at night. I'll go on Teams to do something, and I see the green icons, so obviously they're on. And people are even working weekends now, so there's a lot more flexibility that's coming from working at home. And also, if you are a company that is trying to making people or encouraging people to come back to the office, lots of people have an expectation for certain amenities because they've had time over the pandemic to make their desk, and it's not just technology, it's decorations and other things, that they have it the way that they like it. And if you want people to come back to the office, they're not going to be okay with going back to the little small cubicle that they have. So there's things we have to think about also as a result of kind of things we've gotten used to the past couple of years. So let's dive in a little bit, sort of a deep dive into some things. We'll kind of talk about what was before and what it is now. We'll say that a lot of you may look at kind of some of the things that I'll say we're doing now, and you may say, well, we've always been doing that. And that's great, but I'm just giving very generalizations that may apply to a lot of, particularly maybe if you're a small business. So the first is security. And security is always, before pandemic, it was probably the most important thing, and even now it still is. So pre-pandemic, again, this is very general, but your security structure probably was something like you had your firewall, the perimeter, and then you had your anti-malware layer, maybe that was on the endpoints, anti-malware through your firewall, and then you had controls on the endpoints themselves. Those were things like group policy or application control through your firewall. And so that was generally, I mean, it's not complete, but generally the idea of how you approached keeping things secure and under control. Post-pandemic, though, now we've got remote endpoints. And that necessitates the need for additional tools like VPNs and EDRs. We'll talk about EDRs a little bit later and why I think it's something that everybody should consider having. And things like application management. When you have remote people, it's a little bit difficult to do things like application installs if you don't have a good RMM tool. So something like a Beyond Trust, for example, that lets you remove the local admin rights from a person's machine and still let them install approved set of programs, maybe something that potentially makes sense. Internet communications was another area that has really changed a lot. Before you had your email, maybe you had Business IM, it was a link, and then after Microsoft bought Skype, we called it Skype for Business, and we had phones, and then as far as our group meeting, or remote meeting, it basically mostly consisted of a conference bridge. If you had to do video conferencing, it was probably a PC with a webcam, and it was sort of something that was kind of an afterthought. It wasn't something that was a primary focus, at least for a lot of people. But that obviously has changed. And you'll notice in the first bullet I put email plus IM, but I've kind of put them in one bullet. And that's because with the way that we do communication today, these things are basically like, they run in parallel. A few years ago, I was at Ignite in Microsoft. The way they were building Teams was that this was something that was sort of a quick question, and they wanted to replace email as the way of doing sort of that. That's not even a complete definition of what Teams can do, or Slack, or similar products can do today. Now they are actually full-blown collaboration tools. And so in our environment, we're using Teams, and whereas before you might be emailing attachments for a file, and someone would edit it and send back revision 2, and then you respond to revision 3, and so forth. Now you've got channels and files in there, people can chat, they can live edit, and so it's more than just kind of quick questions about, where do I find the policy for acceptable use for technology or whatever. So it's much, basically almost the same level as email. We still have physical phones, but obviously with remote work, soft phones are going to become something that's more needed, especially BYOD, so it's on personal phones. You might be doing that also. But hybrid meetings is something that is going to be really important, particularly when we have a section of people still working remotely. Video conferencing can no longer be something that's an afterthought. There is an expectation now that when you join a video meeting, the experience of that is going to be the same or very close to what you would get if you were actually in the office. So things like integrated video conferencing solutions, so like a Teams room or a Zoom room, which is basically a device that's has the software built in. When you walk in, you just tap a button, it joins the meeting. They've got HDMI capture cards, and then you can plug your laptop in and share what's on your screen in the meeting that way. Maybe something that's really useful for you. We have just actually completed installing this in all of our small conference rooms in our office. Our next project is to do the real big one. And it has been an absolute game changer for our staff. Just not having to put a laptop with a webcam somewhere or plug things into the TV, but just being able to walk in, tap a button, join the meeting, it has been absolutely huge. So, and having been in meetings in the room and also on the other side of it, it really is a huge improvement over traditional systems. I did also put a bullet point in there about the debate with camera on versus camera off. That's obviously going to be. I've noticed there's an increased tendency to want to use camera on, particularly when I have calls with vendors. I noticed that probably 75% of the time they're joining with the camera on, and so that's just another, an example of how that's becoming something that's more common. The traditional cloud versus on-prem debate, it was a big debate before. It's still a big debate now, and I think that it's still going to continue to be even in the future. But there are some things that are starting to trend a bit as a result of the pandemic. Before the pandemic, again, this is very general, but you might have had on-prem things like your file servers, PBX, VDI data centers, business applications like SharePoint or custom applications you may have been hosting on site. And for your VPNs, you were doing that through your firewall. The cloud was mostly for things like your communications platforms and some SaaS solutions that maybe were cloud friendly. But post-pandemic, though, we're seeing there's a lot more things that are trending towards the cloud. On-premise, you might still have things like your domain controllers and so forth. But the collaboration tools are moving there. Even like PBXs, VDI platforms that we might have hosted on-premise before are now, there's a tendency to think about putting those in the cloud. And a lot of this is being made easier by the decreased cost of these platforms, like Windows 365, which Microsoft released a couple years ago, which is basically a very cost-effective way to do VDI, if that's something that you're looking into. So it's interesting. That seems to be where a lot of things are starting to trend now. As far as IT management, so again, this is going to be not applicable to everyone, but lots of times, or in some companies, the arrangement was, I like to say IT was king. So we had authority to do all the policies, whatever was necessary, then the leadership team would give us that ability to do that. And basically in the past, we could say something like to a user, I don't care how much better Firefox is, we're an Internet Explorer shop, and you're going to use Internet Explorer, and if you don't like that, tough. So, but that's how it was, previously. In addition, as far as our support goes, your traditional office hours, whether it was 8 to 5, 9 to 5, whatever, that was acceptable. I remember my first job, we were 4:30 to 8:30. And so 4:30 we left, and if somebody came down to the IT department at 4:45 with a question, well, you have to come back tomorrow. So that's how it was before. But things are quite different now. Now IT, instead of IT being king, IT is collaborative. And this is actually not just IT. A lot of departments and companies are doing this, where they want to have different teams sort of working together and working through projects in that way. So projects you have that may have traditionally only been like an IT-led function, you might have HR getting involved, or you might have other teams that are involved with that, and that changes the way that we sort of do these projects. There's more considerations, obviously, for thinking, particularly if you're going to the cloud, on how we control access to those resources. If you have SharePoint, by default, you could log into that from any machine. So maybe doing something like a conditional access policy, which is a setting in 365 that can let you limit logins to only domain join or Intune join machines. That might be a way to things that maybe might have been best practice to do before, but not maybe as necessary as today with kind of the current environment. And obviously 24/7 support might not be, or might be something that is needed, particularly with these longer work days and sort of the odd working hours that people are having. So so that may be something that's required. And the last one is work from home BYOD. So what I mean by that is we talked about in the beginning how people were kind of over the 2 years got their desk set up, they had their everything that they wanted. Part of that also involved technology. So a lot of our users were buying mice and keyboards and various things to kind of connect to their work laptop. And they're probably not all thinking about security and about whether this is something that is compliant. If you have compliance requirements in your organization, as a federal contractor and hopefully looking to do some more business with the military, one of the requirements they have is it has to be an American product. So we would understand that as IT, but the end users might not be something they're thinking about. They might be more interested in function or how the design of the product if it has a pretty design. So what's needed now is you have to have more policies in place. What we do is for all our employees is we give them a stipend that they can use to purchase equipment for their home office. And we also have policies in place that say, here's the approved list of vendors, here's the approved products. If there's a product you're looking at that is not on this list, here's the guidelines on how you would determine whether this is something that's acceptable. So from a management standpoint, we've put policies in place to sort of help handle that. All right, so with that done, let's move into some recommendations that I have kind of with the changes. And what I'm going to say is that this might not be, I'm not saying that this is something that everyone should do. This is something that you guys, especially those of you who are IT directors, IT managers, or any kind of IT leader in your company, have to kind of look at what your needs are and make the decision on what's going to be best for you. But some of these things I think are areas that could be applicable to everyone in some way. So the first is security. So security should always be number one priority. I said earlier how this is not something that most end users are thinking about. When they do something, they might come to you and say, "Oh, I found this cool plugin for PowerPoint, and I want to buy it now." And they're not thinking about, is it secure? How does this work with the other tools that we have? And so our job as IT professionals is to sort of be that voice of reason, and security is one of the areas we need to think about. So first is having appropriate policies in place. And I say human and technical policies. We understand what technical policies are. Those are things like group policies, settings in your RMM, and various things that from the technology area put those policies to provide the security. But there's also the human policies as well. If you talk to like KnowBe4, for example, they will tell you that one of the weakest link in security for most companies is the human element. And so making sure that you have acceptable use policies that tell people this is what you're allowed to do on your company machine and this is what's not. And having cybersecurity awareness training that help people learn how to identify phishing emails or things that may be particularly malicious. So make sure you have both of those aspects of policies implemented. Also deploy an EDR solution. So EDR, if you're not familiar with it, it stands for Endpoint Detection and Response. It's not really the most accurate way to describe it, but it's basically like antivirus on steroids, essentially. It is a platform that is behavior-based as opposed to signature-based like traditional antivirus. And it's monitoring for things that are happening on the computer. So for instance, a malicious PowerShell script that runs, it will identify that. If you have settings in place to block it, it will do it. And then what it also does, which is really neat, is it will give you a string of events. So you can go into your portal and see, all right, this script was launched, and then it launched this process, or then launched this child process, and you get a whole layout of what happened, and then you can mitigate it. A lot of the big vendors like Carbon Black, SentinelOne, were very, very expensive. They still are, and were sort of outside of the price range of most small businesses. But fortunately, we're seeing new platforms come out that are very cost effective. These are a couple that I have used and have a little bit of experience with. WatchGuard, and these are the prices at guardsite.com, which is a reseller. They have really good value for WatchGuard, as well as a lot of other vendors as well. But they have their EDR platform that starts at $53.50 a year. That's per endpoint. If you want to get the antivirus, in addition to that, they have, it's like $69. And this is built off of the Panda antivirus platform that they purchased a few years ago. And from my experience, I found it was very intuitive. It was easy to install, easy to deploy, and it's cost effective if you have a limited budget. Another option you can look at is Microsoft Defender for Business. I will say this one is not, there's more work involved to get it rolled out, but obviously, as you can see, it's a lot cheaper. This is something Microsoft released in November of last year, where they did a soft launch and then sort of a trial phase, and then the full launch went live in May of this year. And it is basically a sort of, I don't want to say trimmed down, but it's sort of like maybe small business version of their traditional endpoint protection platform, which they had previously. And this is for companies of 300 users or less. So if that's your size, this might be something that's worth looking into. What's interesting about them is that they price the licenses per user as opposed to endpoint, which most other platforms do. So you can either buy a standalone, $3 per user per month, or you can go with 365 Business Premium if you already, what I'll say first of all is that the nice thing about user is that depending on which license you pick, you could protect up to 5 endpoints. So if you're maybe you have an employee that's got a desktop and then maybe they have a laptop, you can protect both of those with a single license. If you are currently a Microsoft 365 customer, let's say you're using 365 Business Standard to get the email, the desktop apps, and so forth. So you're paying $12.50 a month already for your licenses. So paying $10 more for a premium might be something that's worth thinking about, because in addition to getting the EDR, you're also going to get Active Directory or Azure Active Directory Premium 1, which if you are using a hybrid Azure environment will give your users the ability to do password write back and so forth. You also get Microsoft Intune, so you get some RMM functionality out of that. So if you don't already have an RMM solution you're using, this might be something that makes sense. For just $10 more, you can get all of these other things. But there's obviously other EDR platforms. These are just 2 that I've used, had a good experience with, so it's a couple ideas. Also, I would suggest deploying a cloud VPN. Maybe consider, again, this will depend on your needs and environment, but consider moving from on-premise VPN into cloud. The reason for that is what you want to be doing is when you install a VPN on your endpoints is putting all of the traffic through that. You don't want to be doing what some companies did before where they had split tunnel, which was mostly for performance reasons, where you had like access to company resources would go through the VPN and then internet would go through just the regular pipe. Now that's not a secure way to do it. You want to have everything going through the VPN, and unless you've got a really, really big pipe on premise, you may have some challenges with that. Again, it's very generalization, but in some cases that might be something that's an issue for you. If that is something that's a problem, there's very cheap solutions like NordLayer. It starts at $7 a month, and that's just regular VPN. They do have a gateway function where you can basically connect it to your on-premise environment, and it's through the firewall, so you configure your firewall for that. It does start to get kind of expensive when you go that way. So even though I would recommend that if you go with a cloud VPN, if you're really pressed on your budget and trying to save some money, another option you can look at is something called Hamachi. and it's a product from LogMeIn. I will say that it's very limited in its configuration, but once you've got it set up and it's working, it will get the job done for you. The nice thing is that it's very cheap, and you can actually use these two together. You can have Nord layer running, you can have Hamachi running, and get that security and as well as connectivity to your environment. That said, if you're going with Cloud VPN route, I would strongly recommend going with something like the Nord layer and actually doing the gateway properly, so you have fewer points of failure. But next up is the determine where cloud makes sense. So we kind of touched on this a bit earlier about the on-premise versus cloud. And one question that probably could be worth asking now is, does it make sense to go 100% into the cloud? And a lot of companies are asking that question. There's some things you need to think about if you're doing that. Obviously, if you go to the cloud, it's going to be easier to manage. You don't have to worry about hardware refresh cycles. You don't have to worry about maintenance. But there's also a lot of things that you lose with that. If you lose control, obviously, over that. But certain functions like print management, like Radius, it becomes a little bit tricky because you're putting that all over a single point of failure unless you've got redundant internet in your environment. So that becomes a little bit tricky. There are cloud solutions like Jump Cloud, which are trying to create alternatives to this, but this is something that's a little bit, you start to have some potential risks if you're moving it to the cloud. And you also lose the flexibility of having hypervisor on premise. Just having the ability to spin up a VM, whether it's for testing, whether it's for deploying a new product. We had an example recently at work where we wanted to put a new digital signage solution. So we've got a big screen in the lobby where we show announcements. And so when we were looking at, I said, before we go and spend money on something new, I've got plenty of space on the Hyper-V server. I downloaded Ubuntu, it's free. Got Zebo, free and open source digital signage software. Spun it up and connected it, and it worked. So we were able to save some money that way. If I didn't have anything on-prem, I would have to be paying for Azure VM or something similar, and then you're paying all that compute for something that, for us at least, is not even really mission critical. So we were able to save some money by having that flexibility to do that. So that's things you want to think about. My recommendation is, for what should be kept on-prem, is things like domain controllers. Again, some of you may disagree, but for me, I still think that the hybrid AD has a place today, just from the benefits and the cost perspective. Even if you are in the cloud, I would still recommend having just a small file server. It's really helpful for those occasions where you're deploying a new machine and you just want to have the ability to kind of toss a file around between computers. So it's much easier to do that than trying to log into OneDrive or whatever just to get a file. Various Windows Server features like NPS, DHCP, print server, so forth, I would probably keep those on-prem as well. And then depending on your need, other platforms may make sense too. So that's my recommendation. And everything else as far as email, files, if you're remote staff, it might be something that you might, at this point, might want to start looking at the cloud. So next, another recommendation would be to partner with an MSP. Now, if there's any people here who work for MSPs, I apologize if what I'm going to say might, maybe a little bit offensive or whatever. But I know that for those of us who work in-house in IT, MSPs can be a bit of a mixed bag. We've all heard those horror stories of MSPs, either not doing a good job or holding administrative credentials hostage when you're trying to leave. And so I know we tend lots of times as IT professionals to sort of view them with a bit of caution. But what I'm going to say is that, particularly if you are a small company and you have a small team, I would strongly suggest looking at partnering with an MSP. But you want to get an MSP where your relationship is set up appropriately. And one of the things you want to do is look for an MSP that has a co-management relationship. So this is official term. So when you're interviewing potential MSPs, you want to ask them, do you support co-management? What this is an arrangement where the responsibility for maintaining the environment is distributed between MSP and on-premise IT. There's a couple ways that you can do that. Some do it like a primary secondary, where the MSP has primary responsibility for maintaining things, and then IT can come in if it's needed, but generally we let the MSP handle that. Some arrangements split the roles. They say, for these things, the MSP is going to be responsible, and for this area, that's internal IT's responsibility. Regardless of which way you go, the purpose of having a co-management relationship is to fill in the gaps. So that could be, for instance, if you are a company that needs a 24/7 service desk, and you are a small team of one maybe, or a team of 5, and you don't want to be on call all the time. MSPs have the ability, because of their call centers, to be able to handle that at scale. So that might be something. Or another example could be knowledge gaps. Let's say your team is really good at servers or really good at backup, but maybe networking is not quite our forte. So bringing in an MSP that has that skill can help us in that area. What you want to do, regardless of how you do it, is ensure that you have secondary, I put responsibility, but also it could be access to anything that the MSP is doing. You, as particularly if those of you who are IT managers and IT directors, you are the ones who are responsible for the network, not the MSP. Some MSPs might want to try to take that over, but that's not their job. You are paying them to do it, and they have to listen to you. So make sure that you get an MSP that understands that and is willing to do that. Look for an MSP also that is used to working with internal IT teams. So, and this gets back to the co-management. You don't want to get an MSP that says, "Oh yeah, we can do that." You want to get an MSP that is used to doing that, because there's a lot of problems that can come up if they're not used to kind of doing that sort of thing. A couple ways you can do this: ask them when you're interviewing them, what percentage of your clients have in-house IT. Another trick you can do is see if you're able to get in on one of the webinars that the MSP does. And when you do that, listen to the type of content that's being presented. Is it very technical content, or is it something that's very high-level business? That could tell you maybe who the audience is. Also, during Q&A session in those webinars, listen to the types of questions that are being asked. Are they very technical questions, or are they very basic? If they're very technical, that tells you maybe there's a lot of IT people here, and that's who the audience is and who their clientele is. So just a couple of ways to figure that out. Ask them also for the credentials of who's providing the CIO as a service. So this is a common thing that a lot of MSPs are providing. It's basically someone who has a very experienced, they have a lot of technical background, and they can come and help you with projects or thinking through what product to select, like if you're rolling out a new phone system, for example. Regardless of any MSP, whoever they're going to have doing CIO as a service is going to be very experienced. They're going to have a lot of knowledge in that area. But what you want to check is that they have particular professional experience in your industry and what your company does. You don't want to bring in somebody who maybe has a lot of 25 years of experience, but they've never worked in your particular industry, and they don't understand kind of the unique aspects and needs of what you're doing. So make sure you check that. Also, this should be obvious, ask for what products they support. You don't want to bring in an MSP that is HP certified when you're a Dell shop. Determine if the MSP sells products or services. So what I mean by this is a lot of MSPs right now are getting out of the VAR business, which is the value-added reseller. And part of the reason for that is they're finding it's just not very profitable for them. So what this means practically, let's say that you need to purchase 10 licenses of Acrobat Pro. And I want to get those licenses, and I've got my account, and I want to just add them in because we've got 10 new employees that need them. I might go to one MSP and say, all right, can you give me these 10 licenses? And they'll say, all right, great, I'll contact my Adobe rep. We'll send you the quote when it's ready, and then when you tell me we're good to go, we'll get it processed. You then get an email from Adobe, and you can proceed with setting it up. Other MSPs, though, if I were to go to them, if I needed these licenses and I were to go to them and say, can you give me 10 licenses of Acrobat? They would say, okay, yeah, we'll give you the 10, and we'll set up the account, and we'll you tell us which users want it, and we'll get it rolled out. And then you'd be like, no, I don't want this management stuff, I just want the licenses. And they'd be like, oh, we don't do that. So there are MSPs where that's the direction they're going. They want to do more of a managed type of relationship. They don't want to just sell the licenses. It's probably it's profitability. I can understand why why there's business decisions, but that's something where you have to decide, what is your need? Maybe you want them to manage the account, and so in that case, something like that would make sense. But if you want to handle that yourself, make sure that the MSP you're going with is able to do that, or that you are fine with using another reseller in addition to the MSP to kind of supplement that area. And lastly, determine or ask them, make sure that they will let you use their management tools. That's their RMM, their tools for remoting into people's machines, for patching. A lot of MSPs, if they are used to working with a co-management relationship, will be more than happy to give you client-level access to these tools. Some MSPs that are not as used to this will be, at the very least, somewhat resistant to that. So you want to make sure that you ask them, will we have access to your tools? If they are a good MSP that is used to working with internal IT teams, they'll be more than happy to share that. Right. And the last section is just understand the company's mission and vision statement of your organization. You don't have to have it memorized, word for word, but you should generally have an understanding of, what does our company do? Why are we here? What is our objective? What is our 5-year plan? Every company, if it's that it is, at least it's managed well, should have a 5-year objective where they say in 5 years this is where we want to go. Make sure that in IT that you understand that, because that can help you to do things like asking questions such as, how can we creatively and proactively support strategy? Now I put creatively and proactively. Creatively means thinking about the most cost-effective ways, the best way to meet this need. That can be thinking about how can we use the resources we have currently to fill this need, or that sort of thing. Or it could be, if we have to buy something, what's the most cost-effective way to do that meets the need but is not spending more than is needed. Proactively means kind of thinking ahead. So I'll give you an example from my experience. So I mentioned I attended Ignite. This was like a few years ago. And this was like when Teams had just launched, so it was kind of new. And I remember Satya Nadella was up there, talking about how wonderful it was, and they were. And at the time, our company was not using any kind of chat or whatever. So I thought, well, that's kind of neat, but it's not really something we're using. I'd like to check it out at some point and learn more about it, but I've got other things to do. So I kind of put it on the back burner. Fast forward 5 months. Someone comes to me and says, oh, one of our partners uses Slack, and we want to have licenses for that. And of course, being a 365 shop, having those licenses already, I reply, it's oh, well, we have teams, that will do something similar. Why don't you give that a try first, and then if it doesn't do what you need, then we can spend the extra money to go with Slack. But because I had not done the research, I wasn't equipped to be able to help them. And if you're asking an end user who already in their mind has decided, I want Slack, how much effort do you think they're going to make to try out Teams? So fortunately, well, for me at least, because I wanted to save money, it was sort of a half-hearted effort into it. They ended up going with Slack, and we had to purchase those licenses. But and maybe it was the best, it was what the company needed. But because I had not done that research before, I was not in a position when they came and asked for Slack to say, all right, well, why don't we try Teams first? I'll set up your teams, your channels, you tell me what third-party apps you want, tell me who should be in it, and I'll kind of walk alongside you and help you test it. Because I had not done that, I had to rely on them to do it, and it didn't it ended up they weren't really that interested in trying that. So proactively means doing your research, staying up to date with what's happening in the industry. Even here at SpiceWorld, with all the vendors that we have in the expo hall, even if it's something that maybe you don't think you need, still take like a few minutes and talk to them and see that, it may just be for informational use, something that could come in value, later on. And be paying attention to what the mission of the company is, where we're trying to go with our objectives, and then think about what new technologies or new ways of doing things could help do that. Because what I will tell you is that if you are proactive, you'll be able to get what makes sense to you. But if you let the end user decide, that ship will have set sail. And I can tell you from experience, it is very, very difficult to try to rein that back in and go with something else. We're doing I've done browser migration in the past where we had companies we had users that were using anything they wanted, and then we had to consolidate like on Chrome or something, and it's like pulling teeth sometimes to get that to happen. So be proactive and tackle that in the beginning before you run into that issue. And lastly, just be an active player in all of the corporate meetings, your staff meetings, your roundtables. I know sometimes we're busy. We might, I've done that too. Sometimes you have to skip it because you've got other things to do. But as best you can, try to be engaged. This will let people see that IT is involved with what the company does, that they're invested in that, and that they are an active player in helping the company to move forward. And if they see you in that way, that will help you when it comes time to suggest new things, or when you have to be the person that says no, which unfortunately we have to do sometimes, that you'll be a lot more respected for that. So make sure that you're being involved in that way. That is all I have, so I want to thank you all for coming to my presentation today, and we have some time for questions. Yes?
You said earlier something about something wrong with that using split tunnel. Can you tell me what that is?
Yeah. So it's basically where, like, if regular VPN, once you're connected, like all traffic goes through that tunnel. Some companies in the past, like if you had really low bandwidth in the office, like where I worked, we used to have like 25 meg, and then I think we upgraded to 100 eventually. If you were to have your corporate VPN, like in your WatchGuard, your SonicWall, or whatever, and have everyone in the company all connected at the same time, all sending all their traffic through that, you may have some performance problems. So, yeah. So what some companies do is
a firewall where I have a couple of ports dedicated to the site VPN and Azure. Would you see a problem with that?
Say that again?
I have a firewall
Yeah.
at home with a couple of ports that have a site-to-site VPN to Azure.
Yeah, so and then your Azure, is that where your environment is, or are you doing a hybrid?
Yeah, our environment.
Oh, okay, yeah. So that's your direct tunnel. Right. So if you're using the Azure VPN, I'm not familiar with the Azure VPN, as I haven't used it too much, but I imagine you could route all the traffic through there. But they charge you as you probably know, they charge you by usage. So that'd be something to think about. So
when you said that,
yeah.
Flags or something.
Yeah, split tunnel was something companies did as a way to mitigate the performance issue, where they would just, for anything, if you were going to like Google, then they would not send that through the VPN, and then that wouldn't affect the bandwidth. But if you want to really be secure, particularly if you have like compliance requirements, like if you're doing government work or whatever, they want you to put everything to the VPN. You can't do split tunnel. So, yeah.
Do you have a good resource for IT policies instead of having to present the bill manually, so where should I start?
That's a good question. I don't know any off the top of my head. A lot of it's going to be industry specific. So for instance, if you have compliance requirements, like we have compliance requirements with NIST, and then because we're wanting to do some military stuff, there's something called CMMC, which some of you might be familiar with. And to get like the audit, there's policies that it has to be presented in a certain way so they can check. So if you're working with a consultant, they'll have policy templates and you can use those.
Yeah,
I'll probably start there maybe if you have compliance requirement. see if there's anything specific to that area.
So there's a lot of the cyber training companies,
Mhm.
they'll have generic IT policy templates that can
Oh,
be
okay.
used. So Know-Before, VI Protect, a lot of those will have templates.
Okay, great. Yeah, so you said know before and cybersecurity platforms will have templates. That's great. Thank you. Any other questions?
So you said before we had like an architecture, we had like VDI internal, so, in that case, are you taking the clients and moving them to the cloud, not doing VDI?
Yeah, so we don't do we don't do VDI ourselves. Our MSP does those, and I know one of the things they've done. They used to have like their own data center, and they've moved that all into Azure. And so I think Azure actually has like 2 VDI platforms. Like they have like the traditional Azure VDI, and then Windows 365 is sort of like a small business type product that they released last year as some way to make it cheaper. I think it starts at like $35 a month. And this year they actually had a new feature where you can actually join on-premise domains too. So there's
Join what?
like on-premise domains.
Okay.
So yeah, so you can the one feature I was watching I think it was called Microsoft Mechanics, which is their on YouTube where they show like the new things coming. One things they have is there's like direct integration with Windows 365 into the operating system. So like when you start up the computer and you sign in, you can sign into a Windows 365. Just similar to how you would do traditional VDI. But you would sign into the 365 VM from the machine natively. So it looks like you're running a computer as normal, but you're actually signed into 365. So there's a lot of work. It seems like that's where Microsoft's kind of moving. They're going to start emphasizing that a lot more. It makes it cost effective if you're looking for cloud VDI.
Yeah, that was my issue is I have very little experience with, running things in the cloud,
Yeah.
like desktops on the servers, desktops. And I wasn't sure about figuring out cost. It's like they would say, ooh, how much are you using now? I don't know how much I'm actually using right now. I just know how much the desktops cost when I buy it, or VDI situation, how much it costs when I buy it and get it running internally. But when I try to say we propose moving there, they ask how much would it cost? It depends on how much we use them.
Yeah.
How much bandwidth we're using, how much the end users are doing with them. Depends on the ups and downs of our business.
Yeah.
And so I was wondering if that's like something that for budget reasons, have you figured out a way around?
Yeah, so what I would do is, you guys refresh your laptops regularly? Do you have like a 5-year refresh or 3-year refresh cycle?
Yeah.
So I would use that as, take however much you spent for it. Let's say if you spent $1,500, and then split it into, say if you're doing 3 years, 3 times 12. I can't do math, so I don't know what that is, but split that into that. That would give you your monthly cost, and then compare that to what VDI.
Yeah, but you're still going to have to you're still going to have to replace the machine because you're going to have to VDI on something.
Yeah.
So you're probably close to doubling unless you tell the users to use their own machine.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So you can't really do your calculation the way you said it.
Yeah.
It would probably be closer to double, I would say.
Yeah, you're probably right. Well, the other thing you need to look at is what you're actually doing. For example, when we looked at VDI in the past, this was when I was working at a media production company. So we were very media heavy, and at least at that time, they've improved it a lot since. But media has always been something VDI has struggled with, and so at the time we looked at it, there was it didn't make sense. If you're doing something like a call center, it may make more sense there. So that's another thing, in addition to cost. What he was saying, counting the endpoint plus also the VDI environment itself, is making sure that it can even handle what it is that you're doing. So.
I think, well, obviously not a VDI professional, but I think VDI is very specific based, like work specific. Like a lot of hospitals use it because all they do is like a web page or something.
Yeah.
And if that's all you're doing, then sure, it's cheap. but most users, Microsoft is claiming that even their browser surfing on their VDI is cheap. But again, you have to know what your endpoints are using, what your customers are using before you even look at that. If you don't know what they're doing, then you're jumping in with a blindfold on.
Yeah, that's very true.
That's the way I do it.
Yeah, yeah. Thank you.
Just to get controls.
Any other questions? Oh,
As you talk about EDR, are those OS specific or are there specific EDRs better suited for Mac?
yeah, a lot of them are Mac compatible, so just whatever you're looking at, just check that. Are you guys M1 or still Intel Macs?
A mixture of both.
Okay,
M1
so
and 2 on Macs as well as Intel Macs.
okay, yeah. So there are a lot of the vendors are catching up, but the Apple Silicon was an area where they're still a little bit behind. I noticed there were some vendors that didn't support it yet. So yeah, just make sure if you have Macs to support, check that they support Mac. Check that they specifically support the Apple Silicon if that's what you have too. So yeah. Any other questions? All right, well, with that, thanks for coming, and I'll stick around for a few minutes if everyone wants to come. Thank you.